Sweet. And welcome back, everyone, to Magic Stew. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. If you are one of our returning fans, it's wonderful to have you back. I sound like the Magic version of Mr. Rogers, and I'm okay with that. Mr. Rogers was a great man. But I'm not Mr. Rogers. I'm Kyle Ott from Magic Stew, and with that in mind, let's just get right into it. Today we're talking about the mana curve. Now, if you're relatively new to Magic, you may have heard people talk about this, and you may have been confused a little bit by it. But if you're an experienced player or somebody else, you know exactly what the mana curve is. But today, I want to talk about the mana curve and how it pertains to draft and limited in general. So this is going to be a video aimed more at these beginning players, or if you're coming back from a hiatus and you're really ready to jump back into draft, or if you've been grinding out in a constructed format for a long time, but you've decided that you want to make the jump to limited. We're going to be talking mainly about how the mana curve pertains to that environment. This is going to help you out a lot in your games. It's a great organizational tool, and it's an awesome tool, especially when you're starting deck construction, especially when you're starting out. So with that in mind, let's jump right into it. So when we talk about the mana curve, what the mana curve refers to is an organizational tool where you place cards and creatures and spells according to their mana costs. Like I said before, a great tool for organizing your deck. Really helps you when you're trying to figure out what your game plan is. But again, this is just to give you a visual representation of what the stuff in your deck costs and on what turns you're going to be doing certain things. So I've made a small mock-up of what a mana curve would look like. Obviously, if you're drafting your deck, it's going to look a little bit different than this. You're going to have a lot more cards. But this is the start to a fairly decent white-black vampires deck. I used Ixalan cards here because Rivals is still pretty new. I don't want to make you guys sort of think about, oh, what does this card do? What does that card do? I wanted to put stuff in this little graphic that you're familiar with and that you'll understand. So as you can see here, I've sort of ranked our cards based on their mana cost. So we have a bunch of stuff at the 2-drop slot, we have a couple things in the 3-drop slot, and then we have 2 4-drops and 2 5-drops as well. A good rule of thumb when you're building your mana curve is you want it to look like a pyramid, essentially. The wider your base is, right, which means to say the more cheap cards that your deck has access to, the better off your deck is going to be. Much like a pyramid, the more stable your deck is going to be. So again, you're trying really hard to prioritize the lower end of your curve. You want cheaper creatures and cheaper spells. So there's a lot of formats in Magic, like things like Commander, or if you're playing a control deck in something like Modern or Standard, for example, that don't really do stuff for a while, right? Like you're going to start building a board presence on anywhere from like turn 6 through 10, usually in those kinds of decks. But in Limited, you want to be interacting with the board and with your opponent's board as often and as early as humanly possible. Ideally, you are going to play either a creature or a non-creature spell every single turn in Limited, and it's always going to do something. Either it's going to put a creature on the board for you or take multiple creatures or even a single creature off of your opponent's side of the board. It's all about getting that board presence, baby, which is why we prioritize the early end of our curve, that nice little 2-drop slot, just to go back to our graphic one more time. Now, a good rule of thumb, and this is in response to a question that I get asked a lot by returning drafters or by people who are new to the Limited format, is how much of each kind of land should I have? And now this is a general rule of thumb. Again, I don't want anyone to think that this is like hard and fast and carved into stone, but a good rule of thumb here is that you want to count up the number of mana symbols in your deck, divide that by half, and that's the amount of mana that you want. So for example, if your deck had 16 cards in it, and if your deck had about 20 black symbols and 6 white symbols, you'd want about 5 swamps and 3 plains. So you can see what we did. If your deck had cards totaling up 10 black mana symbols and cards totaling up 6 white mana symbols, you just take those two numbers, divide them in half, and that's about what you want. 5 swamps, 3 plains. It's super simple. Again, it's not hard. It's not fast. I don't want you carving this in your mantle place above your fire, above your fire pit. But it's just something useful to have in mind when you're determining what kind of lands you want and of how many you want. Now, there are of course a couple exceptions to this rule, and we're going to talk a little bit about those right now. The majority of your curve, if the majority of your curve starts with black cards, you're going to want swamps because you can afford to wait to draw the other mana. Now, what do I mean by that? Going back to our graphic really quick, I'm going to keep doing this a lot, I'm sure. let's assume, for example, that this had about 10 cards in it, and 8 of them were black cards, and maybe all of your 4s and 5s were white. This is one of those times where you would still want predominantly black mana in your deck because you can afford to wait to draw a white mana on turn 4 or 5. But again, Limited is all about hitting those early plays as often as possible so that you don't fall behind, so that you're not making suboptimal plays, like burning an important removal spell on a low powered creature just because you've fallen so far behind, or so that you're not making bad blocks and getting blown out by combat tricks, which happens quite often sometimes when you're falling behind. Realistically, you want to put yourself in the best position so that your cards have the highest impact they possibly can. And that's where that mana curve comes in, and that's where you want to make sure that you have all of your stuff, or at least a good portion of your stuff, coming out as early as possible. Now, the other exception that I want to touch on really quick is that if you have cards that have a lot of cards that have double costs that you need to win the game. So, for example, I've drafted decks before that were really bad, and then they sort of just needed to hit a double mana, like a double black or a double white in the casting cost. Board wipe, stuff like Bantu's Last Reckoning or Wrath of God, if you remember Wrath of God being a thing, or Damnation if you played the Planar Chaos Limited environment. Those cards were essential to my deck. My deck wasn't going to win unless I cast those, so I was more of prioritizing mana, not just to prioritize for my curve, but to make sure that if I drew one of those game-winning spells, I could cast it. Now, that's a consequence of bad drafting, but that is something that you need to take in mind. So that's pretty much it for this video. Again, folks, it's really simple, really short. This is just a nice little organizational tool that I wanted you to have access to. I might get Liam to label this as Draft Boot Camp 2.5 or something like that, because it doesn't feel like a full-on Draft Boot Camp video. But again, this is just a nice organizational tool for you to use when you're building your limited decks. Going back, you want that pyramid, baby. You want people to look at you and be like, that's King Tut. That's what you want. But of course, folks, that's really all there is to it. Until